Picture this. You wake up one morning and the sun simply refuses to shine. Not cloudy, not overcast, but as if someone has dimmed the cosmic light switch to its lowest setting. Welcome to 536 AD, the year that makes your worst Monday look like a tropical vacation. This wasn't just a bad year, it was nature's apocalypse trial run, complete with biblical darkness, global famine, and a plague that would make modern pandemics seem quaint. So dim those lights. Maybe turn on that gentle fan for some white noise, and settle in as we explore why 536 AD earned its title as the absolute worst year in human history. Trust me, after tonight, you'll never complain about your commute again. The year the sun forgot to shine. You're living in Constantinople, the jewel of the Byzantine Empire, and it's what should be a bright spring morning in 536 AD. But as you step outside your modest stone dwelling, something is terribly, unnaturally wrong. The sun hangs in the sky like a pale, sickly coin, barely visible through what seems to be an eternal twilight. The light it casts is so weak that you can stare directly at it without squinting, without pain, as if you're looking at the moon during daylight hours. This isn't fog, this isn't clouds. This is something far more sinister, and it's happening everywhere, across every continent, affecting every living soul on Earth. The air itself seems thick, heavy with an otherworldly gloom that penetrates not just the atmosphere, but your very spirit. Birds are confused, flying into buildings and trees as their natural rhythms collapse. Roosters crow at random hours, as confused as you are about when day actually begins or ends. What you're experiencing is the result of what modern scientists now believe was one of the most catastrophic volcanic eruptions in recorded history, possibly from Krakatoa in Indonesia, though some theories point to Iceland or even North America. The eruption was so massive that it ejected millions of tons of ash, sulfur dioxide, and debris into the upper atmosphere, creating a global volcanic winter that would persist for over a year. But you don't know any of this. All you know is that the world has gone mad, and you're trapped in what feels like a perpetual eclipse. The temperature has dropped dramatically. In a time when most people barely owned more than the clothes on their backs, you're now facing bitter cold in what should be the warm growing season. Your thin woolen tunic, adequate for Mediterranean springs, now feels like wearing tissue paper in a blizzard. The psychological impact is immediate and crushing. In an age where people see divine intervention in every natural phenomenon, this cosmic dimming can only mean one thing. God is angry, or worse, the end times have arrived. You've heard the biblical passages about the sun becoming dark and the moon turning to blood. Every priest, every wise man, every street corner prophet is proclaiming that Judgment Day has come. Your stomach gnaws with a hunger that will soon become familiar, because the crops that should be growing in the fields are failing spectacularly. Wheat, barley, oats, all the staple grains that form the backbone of civilization, are withering in the perpetual twilight. The growing season, which should be in full swing, has essentially stopped. Farmers stare helplessly at their fields as sprouting plants yellow and die, unable to photosynthesize properly in the dim, cold conditions. The social fabric begins to unravel almost immediately. Food prices, already high due to various political upheavals in the Byzantine Empire, skyrocket to impossible levels. A loaf of bread that might have cost you a day's wages now costs a week's earnings, if you can find it at all. Markets that were once bustling with merchants hawking everything from spices to silks now feature empty stalls and desperate vendors trying to sell whatever meager supplies they have at astronomical prices. You watch your neighbors transform from ordinary citizens into desperate survivors. The baker who once greeted you warmly now guards his remaining flour with armed men. The blacksmith who used to shoe horses and repair farm tools now spends his time forging weapons for those wealthy enough to afford protection. Children who should be playing in the streets are instead sent out to forage for anything edible. Tree bark, grass, weeds, anything to fill the growing void in their bellies. The sanitation systems, never particularly robust in the 6th century, begin to break down as people become too weak to maintain them properly. The aqueducts still function, but the public baths that were once a cornerstone of civilized life become too expensive for ordinary people to use. The fuel needed to heat the water, whether wood or charcoal, is now precious beyond measure, hoarded for cooking the little food that remains. Your daily routine becomes a grim exercise in survival. You wake not to the song of birds or the warmth of sunlight streaming through your window, but to the same grey, oppressive twilight that greeted you yesterday and will greet you tomorrow. The first task isn't breaking your fast, it's checking to see if you still have a fast to break. Water, thankfully, is still available from the city's systems, but even this becomes suspect as people begin to fall ill from contaminated sources. The clothing on your back, already worn thin from daily use, begins to literally fall apart as you're unable to replace or properly maintain it. Soap, made from animal fats and ash, becomes a luxury item. You begin to smell constantly, along with everyone else. Personal hygiene, once a matter of pride and social standing, becomes an impossible dream for all but the wealthiest citizens. Sleep becomes elusive, not just from hunger, but from the constant anxiety of not knowing what tomorrow will bring. Will there be food? Will there be work? Will the sun ever shine properly again? The darkness isn't just physical. It seeps into your mind, creating a depression that affects entire populations. Suicide rates climb as people lose hope that conditions will ever improve. Your work, whatever it was before the darkness began, either disappears entirely or transforms into something unrecognizable. If you were a farmer, you're now essentially unemployed, watching helplessly as your livelihood dies in the fields. If you were a merchant, you're now desperately trying to trade whatever goods you have for food, often at massive losses. If you were a craftsman, you find that people no longer want pottery or jewelry or fine clothing. They want bread, grain, meat, anything to keep their families alive. The cold is relentless and penetrating. Your stone house, designed for Mediterranean warmth, becomes a freezing cavern, without adequate fuel for heating. You and your family huddle together under whatever blankets and cloaks you own, but it's never enough. Your breath creates clouds of vapor, even indoors. Your fingers and toes become numb, making even simple tasks like preparing food or mending clothes difficult and painful. But before we continue this journey through humanity's darkest year, let's take a moment to check in with our community. Where are you listening from tonight? What time is it where you are? Whether you're drifting off to sleep in New York, starting your morning commute in Tokyo, or taking a study break in London, you're part of our growing family of history lovers. If you're truly enjoying these boring history stories, and I mean really finding value in our exploration of the past, please consider hitting that like button and subscribing. But only if these deep explorations into forgotten times genuinely resonate with you. We're not here to chase numbers. We're here to create something meaningful for people who, like us, find comfort in the strange, fascinating corners of human history. Drop a comment below letting us know what historical topic you'd like us to explore next, or just check in and say hello. Maybe share what's keeping you up tonight, or what's helping you wind down. You're an important part of our growing community, a little corner of the internet where we can escape into the past together. Thank you for your continued support, for for being part of this journey through time, and for making this little corner of the internet a place where curiosity thrives. Now, let's return to 536 AD, where things are about to get much, much worse. The collapse of daily life. As weeks turn into months, the reality of your situation becomes undeniably clear. This isn't a temporary atmospheric disturbance. This is your new reality, and it's reshaping every aspect of human existence in ways that would have seemed impossible just months earlier. Your relationship with food becomes an obsession that dominates every waking moment. The simple act of eating, once taken for granted, now requires careful planning, negotiation, and often desperate measures. You find yourself thinking about food constantly, dreaming about it, fantasizing about meals from better times, calculating and recalculating how to stretch your meager supplies through another day. The grain stores that once seemed inexhaustible are now heavily guarded fortresses. The imperial granaries, designed to feed the population during normal shortages, prove woefully inadequate for a crisis of this magnitude. Even the emperor's stores, impressive as they are, begin to dwindle as the months drag on without any significant harvest. You discover muscles you never knew you had as you spend hours each day searching for food. Your legs ache from walking miles to remote markets, hoping to find something, anything edible. Your back screams from digging in abandoned fields, looking for overlooked root vegetables or forgotten grain stores. Your hands become permanently stained and cut from foraging in increasingly dangerous and unsanitary places. The social hierarchy that once seemed so rigid begins to dissolve in the face of universal hunger. You see aristocrats, people who once rode in silk-curtained litters, now walking the same desperate paths you do, searching the same garbage heaps, competing for the same scraps. Wealth, while still providing some advantages, can't conjure food that simply doesn't exist. Crime explodes across every level of society. Theft, once punishable by harsh penalties, becomes so common that the authorities can't possibly prosecute every case. People steal not luxury items or coins, but bread, grain, and anything remotely edible. You learn to hide your meager food supplies in increasingly creative places, changing locations frequently as desperate neighbors learn your patterns. Violence becomes a daily concern. Food riots break out regularly in the forums and marketplaces. You witness scenes that will haunt your nightmares. Ordinary citizens, people you once knew as neighbors and friends, fighting over moldy scraps with a ferocity that seems almost animalistic. The veneer of civilization, you realize, is far thinner than you ever imagined. Your body begins to change in ways that frighten you. The initial hunger pangs evolve into a constant gnawing emptiness that never fully goes away, even after the rare meal. Your clothes, already loose from the ongoing shortage, begin to hang on your frame like tent canvas on poles. Your face becomes gaunt, your cheeks hollow, your eyes sunken. You catch glimpses of yourself in still water or polished metal and barely recognize the person staring back. The cold continues its relentless assault on your weakened body. With less body fat to insulate you and insufficient food to fuel your internal heating system, you're constantly, painfully cold. You develop a persistent cough that racks your frame. Your joints ache constantly, particularly in the morning when you wake on your hard sleeping surface after another night of fitful, hungry sleep. Personal relationships strain under the pressure of survival. Friendships that once seemed unbreakable crack under the stress of competing for resources. You find yourself suspicious of everyone, even family members, wondering if they're hiding food or planning to take yours. Trust, once freely given, becomes a luxury you can't afford. The entertainment and cultural activities that once enriched your life disappear entirely. The theaters close, not because of government decree, but because no one has the energy or resources to attend performances. Musicians sell their instruments for food money. Artists abandon their crafts to spend their time searching for sustenance. The libraries and schools, dependent on public funding and private donations, struggle to remain open as tax revenues collapse. Your sleep patterns become chaotic and disturbed. The constant anxiety about tomorrow's meal makes deep rest impossible. You wake frequently, sometimes from hunger, sometimes from cold, sometimes from nightmares about the endless grey sky. Even when you do manage to sleep, you wake feeling exhausted rather than refreshed. The city's infrastructure begins to crumble as resources are diverted to survival. Street maintenance stops. Public buildings fall into disrepair. The aqueducts, while still functioning, receive minimal maintenance as skilled workers are too weak or distracted to perform their duties properly. The famous public baths, symbols of Roman civilization, become gathering places for the desperate rather than centers of social life. Your spiritual life becomes both more intense and more conflicted. On one hand, the apparent apocalyptic nature of the crisis drives many people to prayer, fasting, and religious devotion with unprecedented fervor. Churches are packed with people seeking divine intervention or at least spiritual comfort. On the other hand, the apparent silence of the heavens in the face of such suffering causes others to question their faith entirely. Medical care, primitive even in the best of times, becomes almost non-existent. Physicians, even if available, have little to offer patients whose primary ailment is starvation. Traditional remedies often require ingredients that are no longer available. The few doctors still practicing focus on the wealthy who can pay, leaving the vast majority of the population to suffer without any professional medical attention. As the months drag on, you realize that 536 AD isn't just testing your physical endurance. It's fundamentally changing who you are as a person. The optimistic, social creature you once were is being replaced by someone harder, more suspicious, more focused on survival than on living. You're not just witnessing the worst year in human history, you're being forged by it, shaped by forces beyond anything your ancestors could have imagined. The psychological toll becomes as devastating as the physical hardships. You develop what we might now recognize as symptoms of severe depression and anxiety. But in 536 AD, these are simply the natural responses of a mind trying to process the unthinkable. You find yourself unable to concentrate on anything beyond immediate survival needs. Simple decisions that once required no thought, like what to wear or where to walk, now become paralyzing choices fraught with life or death consequences. Memory becomes both a blessing and a curse. You cling to recollections of better times, the taste of fresh bread, the warmth of summer sunshine on your skin, the laughter of children playing in streets that now echo with the sounds of desperation. These memories provide brief respites from your current reality, but they also serve as painful reminders of how far your world has fallen. The children around you break your heart daily. Those too young to understand the full scope of the catastrophe ask questions you cannot answer. When will the sun come back? Why am I always hungry? Are we going to die? Their innocence becomes both precious and heartbreaking, as you watch childhood itself become a casualty of this unprecedented disaster. You notice changes in your own moral compass that would have horrified your former self. You find yourself calculating whether it would be worth stealing food from a neighbor's meager supply. You walk past beggars without stopping, not from callousness, but because your own situation is barely better than theirs. You make alliances based purely on survival advantage rather than genuine affection or respect. The elderly suffer disproportionately, and their plight serves as a grim preview of your own potential fate. Those who once commanded respect for their wisdom and experience now struggle to compete for resources with younger, stronger survivors. You watch grandparents give their portions to grandchildren, slowly wasting away with a dignity that both inspires and terrifies you. Language itself begins to change around you. New words emerge to describe unprecedented experiences, specific terms for different types of hunger, various gradations of cold, and categories of desperation. Conversations that once centered on politics, gossip, or philosophy now focus entirely on survival, where food might be found, which areas are still safe, how long various preserved foods might last. Your hands tell the story of this year more clearly than any words could. Once soft from a life of relative comfort, they now bear the scars, calluses, and permanent stains of desperate scavenging. Your fingernails are broken and dirty from digging, your palms cut from handling rough materials, your knuckles cracked from constant exposure to cold and harsh conditions. And this is still just the beginning. The volcanic winter is only the first act in this year of horrors. Soon, the darkness will give way to something even worse. Disease on a scale that will reshape the very map of human civilization. Justinian the Great, empire at the edge of collapse. While you struggle to survive in the perpetual twilight of Constantinople's streets, high above in the great palace, another drama unfolds that will determine not just your fate, but the destiny of an entire civilization. Emperor Justinian I, known to history as the Great, faces what may be the ultimate test of imperial power. Can even the mightiest ruler on earth command the sun to shine? Flavius, Petrus, Sebatius, Justinianus was never supposed to be emperor. Born around 482 AD in a small village in what is now North Macedonia, he was the son of peasant farmers who spoke Latin with a thick provincial accent that would mark him as an outsider for his entire life. His path to the purple began when his uncle Justin, an illiterate soldier who had risen through the ranks of the imperial guard, brought the young Justinian to Constantinople as his heir. But by 536 AD, 14 years into his reign, Justinian had already proven himself one of history's most ambitious rulers. He had reconquered North Africa from the Vandals, was in the process of retaking Italy from the Ostrogoths, and had commissioned the construction of the Hagia Sophia, which would stand as the world's largest cathedral for nearly 1,000 years. His legal reforms, the Corpus Juris Civilis, would form the foundation of legal systems across Europe for centuries to come. This was a man accustomed to bending the world to his will. Then the sun went dark. Picture Justinian in the pre-dawn hours of that first morning when the volcanic winter began. He's in his private chambers, a man in his early 50s with a round face, balding head, and the soft physique of someone who has spent decades in palaces rather than battlefields. He's reviewing dispatches from his generals in Italy, calculating tax revenues, planning the next phase of his grand project to restore the Roman Empire to its former glory. The emperor, who styled himself as God's representative on earth, the vice-regent of Christ, is about to discover that even divine appointment has its limitations. When the reports start flooding in, they're so unprecedented that Justinian initially dismisses them as hysteria or enemy propaganda. The sun has grown dim across the entire known world. Crops are failing everywhere, from Britain to Egypt. Temperatures have dropped so drastically that snow is falling in Syria. These claims seem so impossible that they must be exaggerated. Surely this is some localized phenomenon that will pass in a few days. But as the hours turn to days and the days to weeks, the reality becomes undeniable. This isn't a regional crisis or a temporary setback. This is a global catastrophe on a scale that no previous emperor, no matter how great, has ever faced. Justinian, who had spent his reign expanding the empire's borders and asserting Roman dominance, now confronts an enemy that cannot be defeated by legions, bribed with gold, or negotiated with through diplomacy. The emperor's first instinct is to treat this as a spiritual crisis. In the deeply Christian Byzantine Empire, natural disasters are understood as divine messages, either punishment for sin or tests of faith. Justinian orders increased prayers, public processions, and religious ceremonies. He consults with Patriarch Minas of Constantinople, demanding to know what sins the empire has committed to deserve such wrath. Has he been too proud in his conquests, too harsh in his taxation, too lenient with heretics? But prayer and penance cannot fill empty granaries or warm frozen citizens. As the crisis deepens, Justinian faces a cascade of practical challenges that test every aspect of his administrative genius. Tax revenues, the lifeblood of the empire, begin to collapse as agricultural production fails across his territories. The armies in Italy, already stretched thin in their campaign against the Ostrogoths, find themselves fighting not just human enemies, but starvation itself. The emperor's wife, Theodora, becomes both his greatest asset and his most challenging advisor during this crisis. The former actress and courtesan, who had risen from the lowest levels of society to become empress, possesses a street-smart understanding of popular unrest that complements Justinian's more theoretical knowledge of governance. She warns him that hungry people don't remain loyal for long, regardless of imperial edicts or religious explanations. Theodora's concerns prove prophetic. Food riots begin erupting across the empire's major cities. In Constantinople, the very streets where you struggle for survival become battlegrounds between desperate citizens and imperial troops. The blue and green circus factions, whose rivalry had already led to the devastating Nika riots just a few years earlier, temporarily unite in their shared desperation. Justinian, who had rebuilt the city after the Nika riots destroyed half of Constantinople, now watches his restored capital descending into chaos once again. The emperor's military campaigns, the centerpiece of his grand strategy to restore Roman greatness, begin to unravel. General Belisarius, his most trusted commander, sends increasingly desperate dispatches from Italy. The soldiers are deserting in massive numbers, not from cowardice, but from hunger. Many are returning home to check on starving families. Those who remain are too weak to fight effectively. The Ostrogoths, suffering the same climatic disaster, are equally affected, turning what should have been decisive military campaigns into surreal conflicts between armies of walking skeletons. Justinian's famous attention to administrative detail, usually one of his greatest strengths, becomes almost paralyzing as the scale of the crisis becomes clear. He spends sleepless nights poring over reports from across his vast empire, trying to calculate how much grain remains in various provincial stores, how many ships might be available to transport food from less affected regions, whether Egypt's harvest might partially compensate for failures elsewhere. The numbers never add up to hope. The emperor's court, usually a glittering showcase of imperial power, transforms into something resembling a war council. The elaborate ceremonies and lengthy theological debates that typically occupy the Byzantine elite give way to desperate brainstorming sessions about food distribution and population control. Courtiers who once competed to display the finest silks and jewels now focus on hoarding whatever food they can acquire. Justinian's building projects, including the magnificent Hagia Sophia still under construction, face immediate resource crises. Workers abandon construction sites to search for food or return to their families. The marble quarries that supply the capital's monuments can't transport their goods because the animals needed to pull the heavy carts are dying from lack of fodder. The emperor who dreamed of creating architectural marvels that would awe future generations now struggles to maintain the basic infrastructure needed to keep his people alive. Perhaps most heartbreaking for Justinian is watching his grand vision of restored Roman glory crumble in real time. He had spent his reign methodically reconquering lost territories, reforming laws, commissioning great works of art and architecture, and asserting Byzantine dominance across the Mediterranean. Now, instead of expanding the empire, he's fighting simply to prevent its complete collapse. The emperor's relationship with his provincial governors becomes increasingly strained as regional authorities face impossible demands. Justinian orders increased grain shipments to Constantinople, but governors respond that their own populations are starving. He demands higher tax collections to fund relief efforts, but officials report that there's simply nothing left to tax. The carefully balanced system of imperial administration, honed over centuries of Roman rule, buckles under pressures it was never designed to handle. Justinian's personal faith, the bedrock of his identity as a Christian emperor, faces its severest test. He had always seen himself as God's chosen instrument for restoring Christian civilization. His military victories, legal reforms, and architectural achievements all seemed to confirm his divine mandate. Now, the very heavens appear to be rejecting his reign. The theological implications torment him. Is this a test of faith, divine punishment, or evidence that God has withdrawn his favor from the empire? The emperor's court chroniclers, usually eager to record imperial triumphs, struggle to document this unprecedented crisis. How do you glorify a reign when the sun itself seems to oppose your rule? The official histories of this period become exercises in creative interpretation, attempting to cast Justinian's survival strategies as examples of wise leadership while avoiding direct acknowledgement of the catastrophe's full scope. As winter approaches, bringing even more severe cold to an already frozen world, Justinian faces a terrible realization. His empire, the most powerful political entity on earth, is helpless against forces beyond human control. The man who had commanded armies, built cathedrals, and reformed legal systems now spends his days calculating grain rations and praying for sunrise. But Justinian's greatest test still lies ahead. The volcanic winter, devastating as it has been, is merely setting the stage for an even greater catastrophe. Unknown to the emperor, as he struggles to hold his empire together through this climatic disaster, a new enemy is already stirring in the east. A microscopic killer that will make the dark sky seem like a minor inconvenience is preparing to sweep across his weakened realm, bringing death on a scale that will reshape the very foundations of civilization. As the months of darkness drag on, Justinian's physical appearance begins to reflect the strain of his impossible burden. Court observers note that the emperor, once known for his robust appetite and cheerful demeanor, has become gaunt and hollow-eyed. His famous purple robes, symbols of imperial majesty, now hang loosely on his diminished frame. The man who once commanded through confidence and charisma now rules through sheer stubborn determination and an increasingly desperate faith. The emperor's daily routine transforms from the ceremonial grandeur typical of Byzantine court life into a grinding series of crisis management meetings. Instead of receiving foreign ambassadors bearing tribute and promises of alliance, Justinian now spends his mornings reviewing reports of provincial uprisings and grain shortages. His afternoons, once devoted to theological discussions and architectural planning, are now consumed by desperate attempts to redistribute resources from less affected regions to areas facing complete collapse. Perhaps most telling is Justinian's relationship with his own reflection. Palace servants report that the emperor has ordered the removal of most mirrors from his private chambers. The man who once took pride in his imperial bearing cannot bear to see what months of stress and inadequate nutrition have done to his appearance. When he must appear in public for essential ceremonies, his attendants spend hours preparing him with cosmetics and padding to maintain the illusion of imperial strength. The emperor's marriage to Theodora, already one of history's most fascinating partnerships, deepens under the pressure of shared catastrophe. While Justinian struggles with the theological implications of their crisis, Theodora focuses on practical survival strategies. She personally oversees the palace food distribution, ensuring that servants and guards receive enough sustenance to prevent internal rebellion. Her network of former associates from her pre-imperial life provides crucial intelligence about conditions in Constantinople's poorest districts. Theodora's influence on imperial policy becomes more pronounced during this period, where Justinian might be tempted to maintain expensive military campaigns for the sake of imperial prestige. Theodora argues for immediate troop withdrawals to redirect resources toward domestic relief. Her street-smart pragmatism often clashes with Justinian's more idealistic vision of restored Roman glory, creating tensions that echo through the palace corridors. The emperor's relationship with his senior advisors also undergoes dramatic transformation. John the Cappadocian, his pragmatic and often ruthless Praetorian prefect, becomes simultaneously more valuable and more dangerous during the crisis. John's expertise in taxation and resource extraction proves essential for survival, but his methods become increasingly harsh as desperation grows. Justinian finds himself approving policies he would have rejected in better times, watching his moral authority erode along with his empire's stability. Religious observances in the imperial court intensify to an almost obsessive degree. Justinian orders daily masses, extended prayer sessions, and elaborate penitential ceremonies, searching desperately for the spiritual key that might end the catastrophe. Palace chaplains report that the emperor often prays until dawn, his knees bloodied from hours of genuflection on the cold marble floors of his private chapel. The emperor's famous building projects become sources of both pride and anguish. Construction on the Hagia Sophia continues, but at a dramatically reduced pace as materials and workers become scarce. Justinian visits the construction site regularly, perhaps finding solace in this tangible symbol of his achievements, but also confronting daily reminders of how his grand vision has been derailed by circumstances beyond his control. Intelligence reports from across the empire paint an increasingly grim picture that Justinian must somehow process and respond to. Provincial governors write of entire cities abandoned as populations migrate in search of food. Military commanders report that fortifications along the empire's borders are being abandoned not due to enemy action, but because there aren't enough healthy soldiers to man them. Tax collectors, the backbone of imperial administration, send reports of regions where monetary currency has become meaningless, and barter systems have replaced the sophisticated economic structures that once powered Roman civilization. The emperor's famous legal mind, which had produced the comprehensive Justinian Code, now grapples with unprecedented questions of emergency governance. How do you maintain law and order when basic survival supersedes legal norms? How do you preserve imperial authority when the state can no longer fulfill its most basic obligation to protect its citizens? These philosophical challenges torment Justinian as much as the practical crises. The plague is coming, and when it arrives, It will test not just Justinian's abilities as a ruler, but his very survival as a human being. The Justinianic Plague, Death's global conquest. As if the volcanic winter wasn't devastating enough, 536 AD had one more horror in store for humanity. Somewhere in the highlands of East Africa, in what is now Ethiopia or Kenya, a bacterium that had lived peacefully in rodent populations for millennia was about to embark on a journey that would fundamentally alter the course of human civilization. This microscopic killer, Yersinia pestis, was preparing to launch what historians now call the first pandemic, or more commonly, the Justinianic Plague. But this story begins not with dramatic human symptoms or imperial proclamations, but with something far more mundane and infinitely more sinister. Dead rats. The first signs appear in the bustling port city of Pelusium in Egypt, where the Red Sea trade routes converge with Mediterranean shipping lanes. Merchants arriving from the south carry more than spices, silk, and precious stones in their cargo holds. Hidden among the grain, sacks, and luxury goods are the black rats that have become humanity's most deadly companions, and within those rats, fleas gorged with infected blood. The mechanism of transmission is elegantly horrifying in its simplicity. Fleas feeding on infected rats ingest the plague bacteria along with their blood meal. The bacteria multiply rapidly in the flea's digestive system, eventually forming a solid mass that blocks the flea's foregut. When the hungry, infected flea attempts to feed again, it regurgitates this bacterial mass directly into the bloodstream of its new host. If that host happens to be human rather than rodent, the plague has found its next victim. The disease spreads through trade networks with the inexorable efficiency of a perfectly designed killing machine. From Pelusium, infected rats and their deadly cargoes spread along the Nile River, carried on grain barges heading north to Alexandria and south into the African interior. Simultaneously, merchant vessels departing from Egyptian ports carry the infection across the Mediterranean to Constantinople, Rome, and every major port in the Byzantine and Persian empires. The first human cases in Constantinople appear in late 541 AD. Just as the population is beginning to recover from the devastating effects of the volcanic winter. Citizens who have survived years of darkness, cold, and famine now face an enemy that makes their previous suffering seem almost merciful by comparison. The plague doesn't merely kill, it destroys bodies, communities, and civilizations with systematic thoroughness. The initial symptoms seem deceptively manageable. Victims develop fever, chills, and general malaise, symptoms that could indicate any number of common ailments. But within days, the telltale buboes appear, swollen lymph nodes that give bubonic plague its name. These painful egg-sized swellings typically develop in the groin, armpits, or neck, turning the infected lymph nodes into visible, agonizing markers of approaching death. As the bacteria multiply and spread through the victim's bloodstream, the infection can take several terrifying forms. In its bubonic form, the most common variant, victims endure excruciating pain from the swollen nodes, high fever, delirium, and often gangrene in fingers and toes as blood vessels become blocked with bacterial toxins. The mortality rate for untreated bubonic plague hovers around 60%, but in the 6th century, without any understanding of bacterial infection or effective treatments, it might as well be 100%. Even more deadly are the pneumonic and septicemic variants. Pneumonic plague occurs when the bacteria invade the lungs, causing victims to cough up blood-tinged sputum loaded with infectious bacteria. This form spreads directly from person to person through respiratory droplets, eliminating the need for flea vectors and accelerating transmission rates exponentially. Septicemic plague, meanwhile, occurs when bacteria overwhelm the bloodstream, causing rapid organ failure, internal bleeding, and death, often within hours of symptom onset. The disease's impact on Constantinople is almost incomprehensible. At its peak, contemporary accounts suggest that 10,000 people per day are dying in the capital alone. The historian Procopius, writing during the plague years, describes scenes that seem drawn from apocalyptic literature rather than factual reporting. Bodies pile up in the streets faster than burial crews can collect them. Entire neighborhoods fall silent as death claims every inhabitant. The social fabric of the city disintegrates under the plague's assault. Traditional funeral rites, essential elements of both Christian and pagan traditions, become impossible to maintain. Mass graves replace individual burials as authorities struggle simply to prevent the spread of disease from rotting corpses. Ships are loaded with bodies and towed out to sea, their human cargo dumped into the Mediterranean in scenes that would haunt survivors for generations. The Emperor Justinian himself falls victim to the plague in 542 AD. Though, unlike most victims, he somehow manages to survive. His recovery becomes the subject of intense speculation and propaganda. Court officials proclaim his survival as evidence of divine favor, proof that God has chosen to preserve his earthly representative. But the emperor's brush with death leaves him profoundly changed, more aware than ever of the fragility of human power in the face of microscopic enemies. The plague's spread follows the empire's trade routes with terrifying precision, creating an almost perfect map of 6th century commercial networks. From Constantinople, infected ships carry the disease to ports throughout the Black Sea region. Overland trade routes spread the infection into the Balkans, while Mediterranean shipping brings death to Italy, North Africa, and eventually Western Europe. Archaeological evidence reveals the plague's devastating demographic impact. Excavations of 6th century graveyards across the former Roman Empire show clear evidence of mass burials and demographic collapse. In some regions, population levels don't recover for centuries. Entire cities are abandoned as death tolls render them uninhabitable. The disease shows no respect for social hierarchies or religious devotion. Peasants and emperors, priests and prostitutes all fall victim to the same microscopic killer. However, the plague's impact varies significantly based on living conditions. Urban populations, with their higher densities and greater exposure to rats and fleas, suffer disproportionately compared to rural communities. The poor, living in crowded, unsanitary conditions, die in higher percentages than the wealthy who can afford better housing and nutrition. Medieval medical understanding proves utterly inadequate to combat the plague. Physicians, trained in the theories of Galen and Hippocrates, attempt treatments based on balancing bodily humors rather than fighting bacterial infection. Bloodletting, a standard treatment for fever, actually weakens patients and accelerates death. Herbal remedies and dietary modifications provide no protection against Yersinia pestis. Religious responses to the plague reveal the deep theological crisis it provoked. Some Christian leaders proclaimed the plague as divine punishment for sin, calling for increased prayer, fasting, and penance. Others interpreted it as a test of faith, encouraging believers to care for the sick regardless of personal risk. Pagan communities, still existing throughout the empire, saw the plague as evidence that the old gods were punishing humanity for abandoning traditional worship. The plague's economic impact proves as devastating as its human toll. Trade networks that had connected Europe, Asia, and Africa for centuries collapse, as merchants refuse to risk travel to infected regions. Agricultural production falls not only due to climatic factors from the volcanic winter, but also because entire farming communities are wiped out by disease. Tax revenues, already depleted by the earlier crisis, virtually disappear in many provinces. Military campaigns grind to a halt as armies are decimated by disease. Justinian's grand project of reconquering the Western Roman Empire becomes impossible to sustain when soldiers are dying faster from plague than from enemy action. The Gothic War in Italy, which had seemed on the verge of Byzantine victory, drags on for decades as both sides struggle to maintain effective fighting forces. The plague creates a feedback loop with the earlier climatic crisis. Populations, weakened by years of malnutrition, prove more susceptible to disease. Simultaneously, the massive death tolls from plague prevent effective responses to ongoing agricultural and economic challenges. Communities that might have recovered from the volcanic winter instead face complete collapse, as disease eliminates the human resources needed for reconstruction. Perhaps most mysterious is the plague's eventual retreat. After devastating the Mediterranean world for roughly 2 centuries, with periodic outbreaks continuing until around 750 AD, the disease seems to disappear almost as suddenly as it arrived. Modern scientists speculate that changes in climate, rat populations, or bacterial evolution might have ended this first pandemic, but the exact mechanisms remain unclear. The genetic legacy of the Justinianic plague can still be traced in modern populations. Recent studies of ancient DNA extracted from plague victims' teeth have revealed that the 6th century strain of Yersinia pestis was likely less virulent than the bacteria responsible for the more famous Black Death of the 14th century. This suggests that the massive death tolls of the Justinianic plague resulted primarily from attacking populations with no previous exposure or immunity, rather than from exceptional bacterial lethality. The plague's demographic impact reshaped European civilization for centuries. The massive population decline contributed to the fragmentation of classical urban culture and the rise of more localized rural societies. The weakening of the Byzantine Empire facilitated the expansion of Islamic powers in the 7th century. In Western Europe, the collapse of trade networks and urban centers accelerated the transition from classical antiquity to what historians call the early Middle Ages. Archaeological investigations continue to reveal new aspects of the plague's impact. Recent excavations in Bavaria have uncovered evidence of entire communities abandoned during the 6th century, their inhabitants presumably victims of the pandemic. Similar findings across Europe suggest that the plague's reach extended far beyond the documented historical accounts, affecting regions and populations that left no written records of their suffering. The Justinianic plague stands as perhaps history's most successful biological invasion, a microscopic conqueror that achieved what no human army ever could. The simultaneous defeat of the world's most powerful empires in the span of just a few years, Yersinia pestis undid centuries of Roman expansion, Christian evangelization, and cultural development, resetting human civilization to a more primitive, localized state from which it would take generations to recover. The plague's psychological impact on survivors proves as transformative as its physical devastation. Those who witness entire families, neighborhoods, and communities wiped out in a matter of weeks develop what we might now recognize as collective trauma. The randomness of survival, where healthy adults die while sickly children live, or where devout priests perish while notorious sinners recover, shatters traditional assumptions about divine justice and moral order. Survivor accounts, preserved in letters and chronicles, reveal a profound shift in human consciousness. People begin to live with an acute awareness of mortality that previous generations never experienced. The plague strips away illusions of security and permanence, creating a mentality that prioritizes immediate survival over long-term planning. Investment in education, art, and infrastructure declines as societies focus on basic subsistence and defense, against an invisible enemy that could return at any time. The disease's impact on family structures proves particularly devastating. Traditional extended family networks, the backbone of ancient social organization, collapse as entire lineages are extinguished. Orphaned children, often the only survivors of once large families, must navigate a world where traditional support systems have vanished. Many are absorbed into religious institutions, contributing to the growth of monastic communities that become centers of learning and cultural preservation during the dark centuries that follow. Marriage and reproductive patterns change dramatically in plague-affected regions. The massive death toll creates significant gender imbalances in some communities, while in others, survivors struggle with fertility issues that may be related to malnutrition from the earlier climatic crisis or long-term effects of plague exposure. Birth rates remain suppressed for generations, not only due to biological factors, but also because potential parents question the wisdom of bringing children into a world where death seems to strike randomly and without warning. The plague's effect on linguistic evolution provides fascinating insight into its cultural impact. New vocabulary emerges across affected regions to describe experiences that previous generations never encountered. Terms for different types of mass death, varieties of social collapse, and gradations of despair enter common usage. Meanwhile, words associated with long-term planning, elaborate social ceremonies, and complex economic relationships begin to disappear from daily speech as the realities they described become increasingly irrelevant. Archaeological investigations of plague-era settlements reveal dramatic changes in material culture. Luxury goods, once markers of social status and trade connections, largely disappear from archaeological contexts. Instead, excavations reveal a focus on practical survival items, food storage containers, simple tools, and defensive weapons. The elaborate pottery, decorative metalwork, and imported goods that characterized 5th century sites give way to crude, locally produced items that prioritize function over beauty. The plague's impact on technological development creates lasting consequences for human progress. The massive population decline means that specialized knowledge held by artisans, engineers, and scholars dies with them. Complex manufacturing techniques, architectural methods, and agricultural innovations are lost as the communities that preserved and transmitted this knowledge disappear. Recovery of these capabilities requires centuries of gradual rediscovery and reinvention. Religious art and architecture from the plague years reflect the profound spiritual crisis the pandemic provoked. Churches built during and immediately after the plague featured dramatically different iconographic programs compared to earlier structures. Images of death, judgment, and divine wrath become more prominent, while depictions of earthly prosperity and imperial glory largely disappear. Mosaic programs in Byzantine churches shift from celebrating temporal power to emphasizing eternal salvation and divine mercy. The plague's documentation presents unique challenges for modern historians. Many contemporary accounts were written by survivors who may have suffered from what we now recognize as post-traumatic stress, potentially affecting the reliability of their testimony. Additionally, the massive death toll meant that many literate individuals who might have recorded events died before they could complete their accounts. The historical record becomes fragmentary precisely at the moment when documentation would be most valuable. Trade networks that took centuries to develop collapsed within years of the plague's arrival, creating economic disruptions that lasted for generations. The complex credit systems that facilitated long-distance commerce became impossible to maintain when entire merchant families died within weeks. Letters of credit became meaningless when the institutions that issued them no longer existed. Barter systems replaced monetary economies across vast regions as trust in complex financial instruments evaporated, along with the people who had created them. The plague's interaction with existing social tensions often exacerbated conflicts and created new forms of instability. Religious minorities, already marginalized in the increasingly Christian empire, faced accusations of causing or spreading the disease. Jewish communities, despite suffering similar mortality rates, became targets of violence from survivors seeking someone to blame for the catastrophe. These patterns of scapegoating would become tragically familiar during later plague outbreaks throughout European history, as the plague years finally began to wane. Survivors faced a transformed world where old certainties had been shattered, and new realities demanded entirely different approaches to survival, governance, and meaning. The year 536 AD had promised to be merely the worst year in human history. Instead, it became the opening act of humanity's first encounter with pandemic disease, a biological catastrophe that would echo through the centuries and fundamentally reshape the trajectory of human civilization. Life among the elite, palaces in the darkness, while ordinary citizens struggled for survival in the streets of Constantinople. Life in the imperial palaces and aristocratic villas presented a fascinating study in contrasts. During 536 AD, the wealthy and powerful faced the same cosmic catastrophe as everyone else, but their experience of humanity's worst year was filtered through layers of privilege, political intrigue, and desperate attempts to maintain the elaborate facades of elite culture, even as civilization crumbled around them. The great palace of Constantinople, that sprawling complex of buildings, gardens, and courtyards that served as the nerve center of the Byzantine Empire, becomes a gilded prison during the crisis. The palace complex, covering roughly 100,000 square meters and housing thousands of courtiers, servants, and officials, suddenly transforms from a symbol of imperial majesty into a fortress against catastrophe. Within these marble halls, the rhythms of elite life undergo subtle but profound changes. The traditional imperial banquets, those elaborate displays of wealth and power where hundreds of dishes showcase the empire's global reach, become exercises in creative rationing. Palace cooks, once artists competing to create the most exotic delicacies, now focus on stretching limited ingredients across multiple courses while maintaining the illusion of abundance. The Empress Theodora, that remarkable former actress who had risen from the lowest rungs of society to the highest peak of power, becomes the palace's most pragmatic voice during the crisis. Her background in Constantinople's rougher neighborhoods serves her well as she navigates the psychology of scarcity, while other court ladies panic at the prospect of reduced cosmetics and jewelry supplies. Theodora focuses on maintaining morale among the palace staff, who keep the imperial machinery functioning. The palace's famous silks, those shimmering fabrics that advertised Byzantine wealth to the world, present new challenges during the crisis. The silk workshops, dependent on carefully controlled temperatures and humidity levels, struggle to maintain production as fuel for heating becomes scarce. The delicate silkworms, temperamental creatures under the best circumstances, begin dying in large numbers as their environmental conditions deteriorate. Court ladies, accustomed to changing their elaborate robes multiple times per day, find themselves carefully preserving garments that would have been discarded after a single wearing in better times. The Imperial Library, one of the ancient world's greatest repositories of knowledge, faces its own survival challenges. The scholars and scribes who maintain this treasure trove of human learning find their work complicated by shortages of parchment, ink, and the lamp oil needed for reading and copying in the perpetual twilight. Debates arise about which texts are essential enough to justify the resources needed for copying and preservation, leading to agonizing decisions about which aspects of human knowledge deserve to survive the crisis. Palace gardens, those carefully manicured spaces that provided beauty and food for the imperial court, become battlegrounds between aesthetics and survival. Ornamental flowers give way to vegetable plots as gardeners convert decorative spaces into food production areas. The famous imperial roses, symbols of Byzantine refinement, are replaced by turnips and cabbages. The psychological impact on courtiers, accustomed to beauty and luxury, cannot be overstated, as their visual environment transforms from paradise to utilitarian necessity. The elaborate court ceremonies that defined Byzantine political and religious life must adapt to new realities. The traditional processions, where hundreds of participants wear silk robes and carry golden implements, become impossible to maintain when participants are too weak from hunger to walk long distances or carry heavy objects. Shortened ceremonies replace the hours-long rituals that once impressed foreign ambassadors and reinforced imperial authority. Social hierarchies within the palace begin to shift in unexpected ways. Servants with practical skills, cooks who can create meals from limited ingredients, guards who can maintain order among desperate people, maintenance workers who can keep the palace functioning with reduced resources, suddenly find their value enhanced relative to courtiers whose skills lie in poetry, philosophy, or ceremonial protocol. The palace's famous mosaics and frescoes, those artistic masterpieces that celebrate imperial power and religious devotion, become sources of both comfort and irony during the crisis. Images of abundant harvests and prosperous cities mock the reality outside the palace walls, while depictions of divine protection ring hollow as the heavens themselves seem to have turned against humanity. Aristocratic families throughout the empire face their own versions of these challenges. The Senator Cassiodorus, living in his villa in southern Italy, must reconcile his scholarly pursuits with the practical demands of survival. His famous library, rivaling even imperial collections, becomes a refuge not just for books, but for the scholars and scribes who maintain them. The villa's workshops, once producing luxury items for elite consumption, retool to create basic necessities for the surrounding community. In the great houses of Alexandria, Antioch, and other major cities, wealthy families discover that money cannot solve every problem. Gold can buy the last available grain in a city, but it cannot make more grain appear when regional harvests have failed completely. Aristocratic ladies, accustomed to imported perfumes and cosmetics from India and Arabia, must adapt to locally produced substitutes or do without entirely. The elaborate dinner parties that once defined elite social life undergo dramatic transformations. Wealthy hosts, who once competed to serve the most exotic dishes, now take pride in creative presentations of basic foods. The social rituals remain, but the substance changes as necessity overrides luxury. Conversations shift from discussions of literature and philosophy to practical matters of survival and resource management. Marriage alliances among elite families become more urgent and more practical during the crisis. Arranged marriages, always partly economic transactions, now focus almost entirely on combining resources for survival, rather than enhancing social prestige. Dowries consist of grain stores and preserved foods rather than jewelry and fine fabrics. Young aristocrats, who might have spent years negotiating perfect matches, now marry quickly to consolidate resources and increase their family's chances of surviving the catastrophe. The traditional education of elite children faces severe disruptions. Private tutors, often Greek intellectuals or Latin rhetoricians, find their services less essential when families focus on basic survival. The curriculum shifts from classical literature and abstract philosophy to more practical subjects: arithmetic for resource management, basic medicine for treating family members, and agricultural knowledge for managing estates. Religious observances among the elite intensify dramatically during the crisis, but with interesting variations based on social position, while common people seek divine intervention for basic survival. Wealthy families pray for more complex requests: the preservation of their social position, the survival of their cultural values, the continuation of their family lines. Private chapels in aristocratic homes become centers of elaborate penitential rituals, as wealthy families attempt to determine what sins might have provoked divine wrath. The famous Byzantine bureaucracy, that complex administrative system that governed the empire's vast territories, struggles to maintain function when its elite administrators face the same privations as ordinary citizens. Government officials, accustomed to comfortable offices and regular salaries, find themselves working in cold, dimly lit rooms for payments that may come in grain rather than gold. Artistic patronage, traditionally a marker of elite status and cultural sophistication, virtually disappears during the crisis. Wealthy families who once competed to commission the finest mosaics, sculptures, and manuscripts now view such expenses as frivolous luxuries. Artists and craftsmen who depended on aristocratic patronage must find new ways to survive, often by adapting their skills to more practical purposes. The system of clientage and patronage that bound Roman society together faces severe strain as elite families struggle to maintain their obligations to dependents and supporters. Aristocrats, who once provided gifts, legal protection, and economic opportunities to hundreds of clients, now find their resources inadequate to help even their most essential supporters. Travel between elite states, once a regular feature of aristocratic life that allowed for the exchange of news, goods, and marriage negotiations, becomes dangerous and difficult. The roads that connected the empire's major cities and estates remain physically passable, but the infrastructure of hospitality and security that made such travel comfortable for the wealthy has largely collapsed. The psychological impact on elite families proves as significant as the material challenges. People accustomed to seeing themselves as masters of their destiny, capable of solving problems through wealth, influence, or political connections, suddenly confront forces completely beyond their control. The cognitive dissonance of watching their carefully constructed world collapse, despite their best efforts, creates a new form of aristocratic anxiety. Palace records from this period, when they survive at all, reveal fascinating details about how elite households adapted to crisis conditions. Inventory lists show the gradual disappearance of luxury items and their replacement with practical necessities. Correspondence between aristocratic families reveals new forms of mutual aid and resource sharing that would have been unthinkable during prosperous times. The children of elite families who lived through 536 AD and its aftermath grow up with fundamentally different worldviews than their parents, having witnessed the fragility of wealth and power during their formative years. This generation approaches life with a caution and pragmatism that contrasts sharply with the confidence and optimism that characterized earlier aristocratic culture. The imperial court's relationship with foreign diplomacy undergoes profound changes during the crisis. Ambassadors from Persia, the Frankish kingdoms, and other neighboring powers arrive at a palace that can no longer adequately demonstrate Byzantine wealth and power. The The traditional gift exchanges that sealed diplomatic agreements become awkward. Negotiations over practical resources rather than ceremonial displays of magnificence. Foreign envoys, expecting to be dazzled by imperial splendor, instead witness a court struggling to maintain basic functions. The palace's famous hippodrome, that massive arena where 100,000 spectators once gathered to watch chariot races and celebrate imperial victories, stands largely empty during the crisis. The elaborate circus factions, the blues and greens whose rivalry had once defined Constantinople's social life, find their passionate competitions overshadowed by more urgent concerns about survival. The few events that continue serve more as attempts to maintain public morale than genuine entertainment, with reduced spectacle and smaller crowds of weakened spectators. Elite women, particularly those in the imperial court, discover new forms of influence during the crisis. Traditional gender roles that confined aristocratic ladies to ceremonial and domestic functions become more fluid when survival skills prove more valuable than social graces. Women with practical knowledge of household management, medical care, or resource allocation find their voices carrying more weight in family and court decisions. The Empress Theodora's background in the entertainment industry, once a source of scandal among traditional aristocrats, now proves invaluable as she understands how to maintain public performance even under extreme stress. The sophisticated banking and credit systems that facilitated elite lifestyle and international commerce collapse under the weight of the crisis. Wealthy families who once lived comfortably on credit secured by their estates and future income suddenly face demands for immediate payment in grain or gold rather than promises. The Italian banking houses that financed everything from silk imports to military campaigns find their carefully calculated risks rendered meaningless by circumstances no financial model could have predicted. Private libraries in aristocratic homes become sites of agonizing decisions about cultural preservation. Wealthy book collectors, facing choices between spending resources on food or manuscript preservation, must decide which texts deserve to survive. Some families burn precious volumes for fuel, while others risk starvation to preserve irreplaceable works. These individual decisions, made in dozens of private libraries across the empire, collectively determine which aspects of classical knowledge will survive into the medieval period. The complex etiquette and protocol that governed elite social interactions adapts to accommodate new realities. Traditional rules about precedence at dinner parties become meaningless, when dinner parties themselves are impossible to host. Social visiting patterns change as travel becomes dangerous and hosts cannot provide appropriate hospitality. New forms of courtesy emerge around resource sharing and mutual aid that would have been unthinkable during prosperous times. Servants and slaves in elite households experience a paradoxical improvement in their treatment during the crisis. Their practical skills become more valuable, and the traditional social distance between masters and servants decreases when all face similar threats to survival. Some wealthy families, unable to feed large household staffs, grant freedom to slaves rather than watch them starve, creating an unintended acceleration of social mobility during the darkest period of human history. As we reach the end of our exploration of 536 AD, it becomes clear that this worst year in human history affected every level of society, from the humblest peasant to the most powerful emperor. The cosmic catastrophe that began with a darkened sun and ended with pandemic disease created experiences that transcended social boundaries, even as those boundaries shaped how people encountered and survived the crisis. The elite families who weathered 536 AD and its aftermath did so not through the traditional advantages of wealth and power, but through adaptability, practical wisdom, and often sheer luck. Their survival stories remind us that in the face of truly global catastrophes, human resilience and ingenuity matter more than social position or accumulated wealth. And so we close our journey through humanity's darkest year, a time when the sun forgot to shine, empires trembled, and death stalked every corner of the known world. The year 536 AD stands as a stark reminder that civilization, no matter how advanced or secure it may seem, remains forever vulnerable to forces beyond human control. Yet it also demonstrates the remarkable capacity of human beings to endure, adapt, and eventually rebuild even in the face of seemingly impossible odds. Tonight, as you drift off to sleep in your comfortable bed, with electric lights to banish the darkness and modern medicine to protect against disease, perhaps you'll spare a thought for those long-ago souls who faced the end of their world with nothing but their courage, their faith, and their determination to see another sunrise. They survived so that we might be here today, inheritors of their resilience and guardians of their memory. Thank you for joining us on this journey through time, for exploring these forgotten tales of human endurance, and for being part of our community that finds meaning in the deep exploration of our shared past. Until next time, sleep well, dream peacefully, and remember that no matter how dark the night may seem, dawn always comes again. The lights are dimming now, the fan hums softly in the background, and history whispers its ancient secrets into the quiet darkness. Rest well, knowing that you've spent this time traveling through the shadows of the past, emerging with a deeper understanding of both human fragility and human strength. Tomorrow is a gift that the people of 536 AD could never take for granted. Neither should we.